Imagine a world on fire, nations collapsing, cities reduced to rubble, and millions of lives hanging by a thread. One war that didn't just change borders, but changed the very course of humanity. Heroes, betrayals, unspeakable horrors, and moments of courage that defied death itself. This is World War II like you've never seen before. A story of power, survival, and the human spirit pushed to the edge. Stay with me, because every second will reveal truths they never taught you in history class. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. World War II Explained, a war that changed humanity forever. Ladies and gentlemen, before this war had a name, before maps were redrawn and cities turned to ash, there were people. A mother packing her son's lunch, not knowing it would be the last meal he'd eat at home. A farmer in Poland waking up to the sound of aircraft instead of birds. A child in London learning the difference between daylight and darkness because bombs fell at night. This is the story of World War II. Not just a war of nations, but a war of humanity. The world on the edge. The year was 1939. The world was still bleeding from World War I. Economic collapse, broken promises, wounded pride. Out of that pain rose dangerous ideas. In Germany, Adolf Hitler promised greatness, but delivered hatred. In Italy, Mussolini glorified violence. In Japan, militarism preached that conquest was destiny. Fear was weaponized. Minorities were blamed. Democracy was mocked as weak. And on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the world crossed a line it could not step back from. World War II had begun, a war without mercy. This war did not respect borders. It did not spare civilians. Cities burned from the sky. Tanks crushed villages beneath their tracks. Families disappeared overnight. In Europe, Nazi forces swept across countries with terrifying speed. France fell in weeks. In Asia, Japan's armies marched through China and Southeast Asia with brutal force. Then came the unimaginable, the Holocaust, humanity's darkest hour. Behind barbed wire and concrete walls, the Nazis built death factories. 6 million Jews were murdered, along with Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and anyone deemed unwoke. Earthy men, women, children reduced to numbers, names erased, voices silenced. This was not chaos, it was organized hatred, and the world did not act fast enough, a world drawn into the fire. In 1941, the war widened. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, turning fields into graveyards and winter into an enemy as deadly as bullets. Then, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. From that moment on, this was no longer a regional conflict. It was truly world war, the cost of resistance. Across the globe, ordinary people became extraordinary. Soldiers stormed beaches at Normandy, knowing many would not return. Resistance fighters sabotaged trains, risking execution. Women worked factories, farms, hospitals, holding nations together. At Stalingrad, soldiers fought street by street, room by room, until the city became rubble, and the tide of war finally turned. Victory was not sudden, it was paid for in blood. The end that shocked the world. In 1945, Allied forces closed in on Germany. Concentration camps were liberated, revealing horrors the world struggled to comprehend. Hitler was dead. Europe was free, but shattered. In the Pacific, the war raged on. Then came Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 2 atomic bombs ended the war, but opened a new era of fear. On September 2nd, 1945, World War II officially ended. What was left behind? More than 70 million dead. Entire cities erased, a generation traumatized. But from the ruins came resolve. The United Nations was formed to prevent another catastrophe. Human rights were redefined. The world swore never again. And yet, history reminds us how fragile peace truly is, why World War II still matters. World War II is not just history. It is a warning. It shows us what happens when hate goes unchallenged, when truth is manipulated, when power is placed above humanity. It teaches us that democracy must be defended, that silence can be deadly, and that ordinary people, when brave enough, can change the course of history. Final words. This war was not fought only by generals and presidents. It was fought by sons who never came home, by daughters who grew up too fast, by survivors who carried memories heavier than metals. World War II reminds us of the worst we can become and the best we must strive to be, because history does not repeat itself exactly, but it always remembers, and now, so must we. The rise of extremist ideologies after World War I did not happen overnight, nor did it emerge from nowhere. It was born slowly, out of humiliation, fear, and desperation, in a world that believed the Great War had been fought to end all wars, but instead planted the seeds for something far worse. When the guns fell silent in 1918, Europe was physical. Why? Exhausted and morally shaken. Entire cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and millions of young men never returned home. The promise of peace felt hollow to those standing in bread lines, staring at empty factories, and burying a generation. Germany, in particular, emerged from the war deeply wounded. The Treaty of Versailles placed the full blame for the conflict on the nation, stripping it of territory, military power, and dignity. Massive reparations crippled the economy, while hyperinflation erased savings overnight. A loaf of bread could cost a wheelbarrow of money, and the middle class watched their life's work dissolve into worthlessness. For many Germans, democracy arrived not as a symbol of hope, but as a reminder of defeat. The Weimar Republic struggled to govern a society that no longer trusted its leaders, its institutions, or even the idea of truth itself. In this environment, extremist ideologies found fertile ground. When people feel powerless, they look for certainty. When societies are humiliated, they crave restoration. Radical movements offered simple answers to complex problems, promising strength instead of compromise, unity instead of debate. They identified enemies to blame: foreign powers, political opponents, ethnic and religious minorities, and transformed anger into purpose. Fear became a political tool, and resentment was reshaped into ideology. Adolf Hitler rose not because he created these emotions, but because he understood how to weaponize them. He spoke to a population that felt betrayed by elites and ignored by the world. His speeches were not policy discussions. They were emotional performances, blending nationalism with myth, history with lies. He promised to restore Germany's greatness, to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, to rebuild the army, and to give people something they felt had been stolen from them: pride. For those struggling to survive, these promises sounded like salvation. Italy followed a similar path. Benito Mussolini capitalized on post-war chaos, unemployment, and fear of socialist revolution. He portrayed democracy as weak and disorderly, incapable of restoring national honor. Fascism glorified violence, discipline, and obedience, presenting the state as more important than the individual. Marches, symbols, and slogans replaced reasoned debate, and many Italians embraced the illusion of strength over the uncertainty of freedom. In Japan, extremist ideology took a different form, but was driven by comparable pressures: rapid industrialization, population growth, and limited natural resources fueled a belief that expansion was necessary for survival. Military leaders promoted the idea that Japan was destined to rule Asia, framing conquest as both a strategic necessity and a moral mission. Democratic institutions existed but were overshadowed by a culture that revered the military and discouraged dissent. National identity became inseparable from obedience and sacrifice. The global economic collapse of the Great Depression in 1929 accelerated these trends. As banks failed and unemployment soared, faith in democratic systems weakened further. Extremist movements claimed that liberal democracy and capitalism had failed, pointing to empty factories and hungry families as evidence. Authoritarian leaders promised stability, jobs, and national revival, often through rearmament and expansion. Tanks, factories, and uniforms did not just prepare nations for war. They gave people work, direction, and a sense of belonging. Propaganda played a crucial role in sustaining these ideologies. Governments controlled newspapers, radio, education, and art, shaping how people understood reality. History was rewritten to glorify the nation and erase inconvenient truths. Children were taught loyalty before critical thinking. Repetition replaced evidence, and emotion overwhelmed logic. Over time, lies felt familiar, and familiarity felt like truth. Violence became normalized. Political opponents were silenced, imprisoned, or killed, often with public approval. Laws stripped minorities of rights step by step, so gradually that many failed to see where it was leading. Each act of exclusion made the next easier. Extremist ideology thrives not only on loud supporters, but also on quiet acceptance, on people who convince themselves that survival requires compliance. Internationally, the response was weak and fragmented. Many nations, still traumatized by World War I, feared confrontation more than aggression. Appeasement was seen as a path to peace, allowing extremist regimes to grow stronger without resistance. Each unchallenged violation of treaties reinforced the belief that force worked and that the world lacked the will to stop it. What made these ideologies especially dangerous was their ability to present themselves as inevitable. They framed history as a struggle between the strong and the weak, portraying compassion as weakness and brutality as realism. War was not a tragedy to be avoided, but a test to be embraced. Death was romanticized, sacrifice demanded, and individuality dissolved into mass identity. Ordinary people became participants in extraordinary cruelty, not always out of hatred, but out of conformity, fear, or belief that they had no alternative. Extremist ideologies succeeded because they transformed personal suffering into collective purpose. Offering belonging at the cost of humanity, they convinced millions that moral compromise was temporary, that violence was necessary, and that the future would justify the present. The rise of true ESE ideologies before World War II was not simply a failure of leadership, but a failure of systems, safeguards, and shared responsibility. Economic despair, political instability, wounded national pride, and unchecked propaganda converged into a force that reshaped nations from within. By the time the world recognized the danger, extremist beliefs were no longer on the fringes, but embedded in governments, armies, and daily life, shaping decisions that would soon plunge the world into a conflict unlike any it had ever known. The Second World War transformed warfare into something the world had never fully experienced before, a form of conflict in which the boundary between the battlefield and everyday life disappeared. It was no longer a war fought only by soldiers in uniform meeting on distant fronts. It became a total war, drawing entire populations into its machinery. and making civilians as central to the conflict as the armies themselves. Homes, factories, schools, hospitals, and places of worship all became part of the war zone, vulnerable to destruction and loss. From the very beginning, modern technology ensured that no one was truly safe. Aircraft extended the reach of war far beyond front lines, allowing bombs to fall deep inside cities. London, Berlin, Tokyo, Dresden, and countless other urban centers became targets not because of what they did on the battlefield, but because of who lived and worked there. Night after night, civilians huddled in shelters as the sky roared above them, unsure if their homes would still be standing by morning. Children learned to identify the sound of incoming bombs before they learned multiplication tables. Industries became weapons. Factories that once produced consumer goods were repurposed to build tanks, planes, ammunition, and ships. Civilian workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored long hours under constant pressure, knowing that their productivity could mean the difference between victory and defeat. A miss-edge shift, a faulty component, or a delayed shipment was framed as sabotage. The war demanded not only physical labor, but emotional endurance, as exhaustion became routine and rest felt like a luxury. Food became a strategic resource. Blockades and disrupted trade routes caused shortages that affected entire populations. Rationing controlled how much bread, meat, sugar, and fuel people could consume. Turning daily meals into calculations of survival. In occupied territories, starvation was often used as a weapon, deliberately weakening populations and breaking resistance. Parents went hungry so their children could eat, while black markets thrived as desperation blurred moral boundaries. The concept of civilian immunity collapsed completely. Entire populations were treated as legitimate targets under the logic that breaking morale would shorten the war. Firebombing campaigns reduced neighborhoods to ash in minutes, trapping families inside burning buildings. In places like Hamburg and Tokyo, firestorms consumed oxygen itself, leaving survivors struggling to breathe among the ruins. These attacks were planned, calculated, and justified as necessary, even as the human cost reached unimaginable levels. Occupation brought another layer of suffering. In countries overrun by foreign armies, daily life became an exercise in fear and adaptation. Civilians lived under curfews, surveillance, and constant threat of punishment. A wrong word, a hidden radio, or an act of quiet resistance could result in imprisonment or execution. Entire villages were destroyed in retaliation for partisan activity, often without proof, as occupying forces sought to control populations through terror. Mass displacement became a defining feature of the war. Millions fled advancing armies, carrying whatever they could hold, leaving behind homes they would never see again. Refugees crowded roads, camps, and border crossings, vulnerable to disease, hunger, and violence. Families were separated in seething house, children lost in the movement of people. Identities reduced to scraps of paper or fading memories. The war created a world where belonging was temporary and safety uncertain. Genocide and systematic violence elevated civilian suffering to an unprecedented scale. The Holocaust demonstrated how total war extended beyond physical destruction into ideological annihilation. Civilians were not accidental victims, but primary targets, selected for who they were rather than what they did. Ghettos, camps, and mass executions became tools of policy, transforming murder into administration. Trains, schedules, and bureaucratic forms became as lethal as guns, embedding violence into everyday systems. In Asia, civilians endured equally brutal conditions. Japanese occupation across China and South East Asia involved forced labor, sexual slavery, and mass killings. Cities like Nanjing became symbols of unchecked brutality, where civilians were slaughtered on a scale that defied comprehension. Villages were emptied, cultures suppressed, and fear used to maintain control. For many, survival meant silence, obedience, and the constant risk of sudden violence. Children experienced the war not as history, but as reality. Education was disrupted, childhood shortened, and trauma normalized. Many were evacuated from cities, separated from parents for years, while others grew up amid ruins and ration lines. Some were indoctrinated into extremist ideologies, taught to see war as heroic before they could fully understand death. Others became orphans, navigating a world stripped of stability, carrying memories that would shape their entire lives. Even those far from the front lines were not untouched. Radio broadcasts carried news of battles, losses, and propaganda into living rooms, making war a constant presence. Letters from soldiers became lifelines, their absence a source of dread. Entire communities lived in cycles of hope and grief, celebrating victories while mourning neighbors. Whose names appeared on casualty lists. The emotional toll extended beyond physical harm, embedding anxiety and loss into the fabric of society. Medical systems were overwhelmed by the scale of destruction. Hospitals struggled with shortages of supplies, staff, and safe facilities. Civilian doctors and nurses worked under bombardment, treating victims of air raids alongside wounded soldiers. Dysphagia spread rapidly in crowded shelters and camps, turning illness into another silent killer. The distinction between military and civilian casualties became increasingly meaningless as suffering followed no uniform. Total war also reshaped morality. Actions once considered unthinkable became routine under the pressure of survival. Bombing civilians, targeting infrastructure, and accepting mass casualties were justified as necessary evils. Governments framed these choices as unavoidable, while individuals struggled to reconcile personal values with collective demands. The war forced societies to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, guilt, and the cost of victory. By drawing civilians into every aspect of conflict, World War II erased the illusion that war could ever be contained. It demonstrated that modern warfare consumes entire nations, demanding not only soldiers, but workers, families, and children. The front line was everywhere, stretching from beaches and trenches to kitchens and classrooms. The war was fought in the skies above cities, in the silence of occupied homes, in the factories that never slept, and in the hearts of people who learned to endure low SS as part of daily life, turning survival itself into an act of resistance against a world consumed by violence and fear. The Holocaust stands as the most deliberate and systematic assault on human life in modern history, not as an accident of war, but as a central goal embedded within Nazi ideology. It began not with gas chambers or mass graves, but with words, laws, and social exclusion. Long before the killing started, Jews were portrayed as enemies within, blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I, economic hardship, and cultural decline. Propaganda reduced human beings to stereotypes, repeating lies until prejudice felt like truth. Neighbors were taught to see neighbors as threats, and suspicion became normalized in everyday life. Step by step, Jewish people were pushed out of society. Businesses were boycotted. Professionals were dismissed, and citizenship was stripped away through laws that redefined who counted as human. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 transformed identity into a crime, making ancestry a basis for punishment. These measures were often enforced quietly, bureaucratically, through paperwork and stamps, allowing violence to hide behind legality. Many who witnessed this process did not yet see where it would lead, while others chose not to see at all. When war began, the scale of persecution expanded rapidly. Jewish families were forced into ghettos, crowded, sealed neighborhoods, surrounded by walls and guards. Life inside these ghettos was defined by hunger, disease, and constant fear. Food rations were deliberately insufficient, turning starvation into pole. Icy. Children grew weak before their teenage years, and the elderly died quietly in unheated rooms. Despite this, cultural and spiritual life persisted in secret as people clung to music, education, and faith as acts of resistance against erasure. The invasion of Eastern Europe marked a turning point. Mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed German armies into Poland, Ukraine, and the Soviet Union. Their mission was simple and horrifying: mass murder. Entire communities were rounded up, marched to forests or ravines, and shot. Men, women, and children were killed together, their bodies buried in mass graves. These killings were often carried out in broad daylight, witnessed by local populations, leaving behind landscapes permanently scarred by violence. As the war continued, Nazi leadership sought more efficient methods of killing. This led to the creation of extermination camps designed not for imprisonment but for death. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Chelmno became industrial centers of murder. Trains transported victims from across Europe packed into cattle cars with no food, water, or sanitation. Many died before reaching their destination. Those who survived the journey were subjected to selections that decided life or death within seconds. Inside the camps, humanity was systematically dismantled. Names were replaced with numbers, hair was shaved, belongings confiscated. Families were torn apart, often never seeing each other again. Gas chambers disguised as showers became tools of mass execution, while crematoria burned day and night to erase evidence of the dead. The process was engineered for efficiency, turning murder into routine labor for guards and administrators. Ordinary workers became participants in extraordinary crimes through obedience and repetition. Those not immediately killed were forced into labor under conditions designed to destroy them slowly. Prisoners worked in factories, quarries, and construction sites, weakened by starvation and disease. Medical experiments were conducted without consent, treating human beings as disposable objects. Survival depended on chance, physical strength, and often the sacrifice of others. Moral choices became impossible under a system designed to eliminate dignity alongside life. The Holocaust did not target Jews alone. Roma communities were nearly destroyed, disabled individuals were murdered under euthanasia programs, and political opponents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others deemed undesirable were imprisoned and killed. Each group was dehumanized through different justifications, but all were subjected to the same logic, that some lives were worth less than others. The machinery of genocide proved adaptable, capable of absorbing new victims as ideology demanded. The role of bystanders and collaborators complicates the narrative. The Holocaust required more than Nazi leadership to function. Local authorities, railway workers, factory managers, and civilians across occupied Europe contributed, whether through active participation or passive compliance. Some benefited from stolen property or vacant jobs, while others feared punishment if I resisted. At the same time, acts of courage emerged. Individuals who hid families, forged documents, or smuggled children to safety, often at the cost of their own lives. Information about the atrocities existed, yet disbelief and denial slowed international response. Reports of mass killings were dismissed as exaggerations, while wartime priorities overshadowed humanitarian intervention. Border remained closed to many refugees, forcing them back into danger. The Holocaust unfolded not only because of hatred, but because of indifference, hesitation, and the failure to recognize the urgency of moral responsibility. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1944 and 1945, they encountered scenes that defied language. Survivors stood skeletal, surrounded by piles of bodies and abandoned belongings. The scale of death challenged comprehension, confronting the world with evidence of what unchecked ideology could produce. Liberation did not end suffering immediately. Many survivors died from illness and starvation even after freedom arrived, while others faced the impossible task of rebuilding lives without families, homes, or communities. The Holocaust exposed the capacity of modern states to organize mass murder using technology, bureaucracy, and obedience. It demonstrated how prejudice, when combined with power, could transform neighbors into executioners and institutions into instruments of death. This crime against humanity was not the result of madness alone, but of planning, cooperation, and gradual normalization of evil. It unfolded because a society accepted the idea that some people could be excluded from moral concern, reduced to problems to be solved rather than lives to be protected. The legacy of the Holocaust extends beyond the millions who were killed. It reshaped international law, human rights discourse, and the understanding of genocide itself. It stands as a reminder that violence on such a scale does not begin with weapons, but with language, exclusion, and with silence. It forces an ongoing confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human behavior, obedience, and the fragility of moral boundaries under pressure. The Holocaust remains a permanent scar on human history, a testament to how far cruelty can go when ideology replaces empathy, and when the destruction of one group is justified as a necessity for the survival of another. The turning points of World War II were not single moments of sudden victory, but long, painful shifts forged through sacrifice, endurance, and loss. For years, the Axis powers appeared unstoppable. Their early successes created an illusion of invincibility as country after country fell with alarming speed. Yet beneath this momentum, weaknesses existed, and slowly, through a series of brutal confrontations, the balance of power began to change. In the East, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 marked a critical overreach. Operation Barbarossa was designed to crush the Red Army quickly and seize vast territory, but instead, it exposed the limits of Nazi power. German forces advanced deep into Soviet land, but supply lines stretched thin, equipment wore down, and resistance hard. The vastness of the terrain and the ferocity of Soviet defense transformed what was meant to be a swift campaign into a war of attrition. Civilians were caught between retreating and advancing armies, while entire villages were destroyed in the process. The Battle of Stalingrad became a defining moment. What began as a strategic objective turned into a symbolic struggle that neither side was willing to abandon. Soldiers fought not just for streets, but for individual buildings, staircases, and rooms. Winter closed in, freezing weapons and bodies alike. Encircled and cut off, the German Sixth Army slowly collapsed under relentless Soviet pressure. When it finally surrendered in early 1943, it marked the first complete destruction of a German field army and shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. From that point forward, the Eastern Front became a steady push westward, fueled by immense human cost. In North Africa, the tide also shifted through a combination of leadership, logistics, and coordination. Early Axis victories under Erwin Rommel threatened Allied access to the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil supplies. However, the Allies regrouped, learning from early defeats and improving supply chains. At the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, British forces halted and then pushed back Axis troops. This victory was not just tactical but psychological, proving that Axis expansion could be stopped and reversed. It opened the door for Allied landings in North Africa, squeezing Axis forces from multiple directions. Meanwhile, the war at sea played a quiet but decisive role. Control of the Atlantic was essential for sustaining Allied forces, particularly Britain and later the Soviet Union. German U-boats initially inflicted devastating losses on merchant shipping, threatening to starve Britain into submission. Over time, advances in radar, sonar, air patrols, and coordinated convoy systems reduced the effectiveness of submarine warfare. The gradual Allied dominance of the Atlantic ensured a continuous flow of troops, equipment, and supplies, creating the foundation for future offensives. In the Pacific, the turning point came with the Battle of Midway in 1942. Japan entered the war with a powerful navy and a series of rapid conquests that shocked the world. Midway changed this trajectory through intelligence breakthroughs and risky decision-making. The United States Navy ambushed Japanese carrier forces, sinking 4 carriers in a single battle. The loss crippled Japan's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. From that moment on, the Pacific War shifted into a long, grinding campaign of island hopping where each advance came at a high cost. Guadalcanal further demonstrated the changing balance. It was the first major Allied offensive against Japanese-held territory and tested endurance on both sides. Disease, hunger, and constant combat defined the campaign. Control of the island shifted repeatedly, but eventually Japanese forces withdrew, marking the first time they had been forced to abandon occupied territory. The psychological impact of this withdrawal echoed across the Pacific, signaling that Japan's expansion had reached its limit. The entry of the United States into the war transformed its scale and momentum. American industrial capacity reshaped the conflict, turning factories into engines of war that produced ships, planes, and vehicles at an unprecedented rate. This industrial output allowed the Allies to replace losses quickly and sustain prolonged campaigns, soldiers arriving on distant shores re-backed by an economy fully mobilized for total war, giving the Allies a growing advantage that Axis powers struggled to match. In Western Europe, the long-awaited Allied invasion came in June 1944 with the landings in Normandy. D-Day was not a single battle, but a complex operation involving deception, logistics, and coordination on a massive scale. Soldiers stormed heavily defended beaches under intense fire, many never making it past the shoreline. Those who survived pushed inland, securing a foothold that allowed millions of troops and tons of supplies to pour into France. The liberation of Western Europe began not with celebration, but with bitter fighting through hedgerows, towns, and cities reduced to rubble as Allied forces advanced from the West and Soviet forces from the EAS. Germany found itself fighting a war it could no longer win. Bombing campaigns intensified, crippling industrial centers and transportation networks. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized tanks. Civilians endured relentless air raids while morale collapsed under the weight of inevitable defeat. Attempts at last-ditch offensives, such as the Battle of the Bulge, delayed the end, but company not reverse the outcome. In the Pacific, the war grew increasingly brutal as Allied forces closed in on Japan. Battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa demonstrated the cost of each step forward. Japanese defenders fought to the death while civilians were caught in the crossfire, often driven to despair by propaganda and fear. These battles revealed the scale of resistance that an invasion of the Japanese mainland would face shaping decisions that followed. The convergence of military pressure, industrial dominance, and strategic coordination gradually dismantled Axis power. Each turning point was interconnected, built upon earlier sacrifices and lessons learned through failure. Victory did not arrive suddenly or cleanly. It emerged through exhaustion, loss, and the relentless push of four CES that adapted while their enemies weakened. The shift in balance was measured not just in territory gained, but in broken supply lines, lost confidence, and the realization that the momentum of war had irreversibly changed direction. The lasting impact of World War II on global order, peace, and human rights cannot be overstated. The war reshaped the political, social, and economic structure of the world, leaving behind consequences that continue to influence international relations and domestic policies decades later. The conflict created a profound awareness of the cost of unchecked aggression, ideological extremism, and the failure of international institutions to prevent catastrophe. It was a turning point that forced humanity to confront the vulnerability of civilization and the FRA, agility of moral and legal boundaries. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were destroyed, economies collapsed, and millions of people were displaced. Infrastructure, from railways and bridges to ports and factories, had been systematically dismantled or destroyed, making the reconstruction of everyday life a monumental task. Governments struggled to maintain basic services, while populations faced famine, disease, and homelessness. The sheer scale of destruction emphasized that the modern industrialized state could generate both incredible productivity and unimaginable destruction, depending on how its resources were directed. The war also led to a massive realignment of global power. Traditional European powers, weakened by years of combat and occupation, saw their influence diminish. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy were forced to focus on rebuilding, leaving a vacuum in global politics. Meanwhile, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, each wielding unprecedented military, economic, and political influence. This shift set the stage for the Cold War, a decades-long struggle for global influence that would define the second half of the 20th century. The division of Europe into spheres of influence, the establishment of the Iron Curtain, and the nuclear arms race were all direct consequences of the way World War II reshaped power dynamics. One of the most significant legacies of the war was the creation of international institutions designed to prevent future conflicts on such a scale. The United Nations was founded in 1945 with the explicit purpose of promoting peace, human rights, and cooperation between nations. Its charter reflected lessons learned from the failures of the League of Nations and the inadequacy of diplomatic mechanisms before and during the war. The UN sought to provide a forum for dialogue, mediation, and the collective enforcement of international law. Although imperfect, it represented a fundamental acknowledgement that global peace could not be left to chance and that sovereignty must be balanced with shared responsibility. Human rights became a central concern in the post-war world, largely in response to the atrocities committed during the conflict, particularly the Holocaust. The recognition that governments could perpetrate systematic crimes against their own citizens led to the establishment of universal human rights standards. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, articulated fundamental protections for all individuals, regardless of nationality, religion, or ethnicity. It set a moral and legal benchmark, asserting that atrocities like genocide, torture, and arbitrary imprisonment could no longer be tolerated or excused under the guise of state sovereignty. The Nuremberg trials were another pivotal outcome, establishing the principle that individuals, including state leaders, could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. For the first time, international law prosecuted war crimes on a large scale, emphasizing that obedience to orders was not an excuse for participation in systematic murder, forced labor, or other atrocities. These trials set precedents for international criminal law, influencing later tribunals and the eventual creation of the International Criminal Court. They also sent a moral message to the world that human rights violations could no longer remain invisible or unpunished, and that justice, while imperfect, must be pursued even amid political complexity. The war also prompted massive population movements, reshaping societies and borders. Millions of refugees, displaced persons, and survivors migrated across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Borders were redrawn, ethnic groups relocated, and entire communities uprooted, often violently. These movements had lasting social and literal effects, influencing demographics, labor markets, and national identities. In some cases, forced migrations and expulsions created long-standing tensions, while in others, they facilitated cultural exchange and the reconstruction of devastated communities. The displacement caused by the war underscored the need for international cooperation in managing humanitarian crises, refugee protectio, and post-conflict recovery. Economically, the war accelerated industrial and technological development while also highlighting the need for international cooperation in trade and reconstruction. The Marshall Plan exemplified this approach, providing billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Western European economies. By stabilizing these nations and fostering economic growth, the plan aimed to prevent the conditions of poverty and instability that had contributed to the rise of extremism before the war. Globally, the post-war economy became increasingly interconnected, leading to institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which sought to manage financial stability, development, and reconstruction on a transnational scale. Culturally and socially, World War II left an enduring imprint on consciousness and memory. Art, literature, and cinema reflected both the trauma and resilience of humanity, exploring themes of survival, moral ambiguity, and the consequences of violence. Survivors' testimonies, memoirs, and oral histories became crucial tools for education and remembrance, shaping how subsequent generations understood the human cost of war. Memorials and museums dedicated to victims and veterans further reinforced collective memory, serving as reminders of both sacrifice and the responsibility to prevent repetition of such horrors. The war also influenced military doctrine and strategy in the decades that followed. The scope and scale of total war demonstrated the importance of logistics, intelligence, air power, mechanized units, and coordinated multinational operations. Military planners and political leaders studied the lessons of World War II to understand how technological innovation, resource management, and morale could determine the outcome of large-scale conflicts. Nuclear weapons developed in the final stages of the war added a new dimension to strategy, deterrence, and international diplomacy, fundamentally altering the calculus of power and security. Furthermore, World War II reshaped the relationship between citizens and their governments. The scale of mobilization, both human and economic, created expectations of accountability, transparency, and protection of civil liberties. Social contracts were renegotiated as governments took responsibility for welfare, reconstruction, and veteran support. The war also catalyzed movements for decolony. Nation as European powers weakened by years of combat faced pressure from colonies seeking independence. These struggles for sovereignty and self-determination were influenced by the principles of freedom, equality, and human rights that emerged in the post-war era. The psychological impact of the war on individuals and societies also contributed to its lasting influence. Survivors carried trauma that shaped families, communities, and national identities. Collective experiences of loss, displacement, and resilience created narratives that informed politics, education, and culture. At the same time, the recognition of shared suffering across nations fostered initiatives for reconciliation, dialogue, and cooperation. International collaboration, whether through diplomacy, humanitarian aid, or cultural exchange, became central to the effort to prevent future conflicts. Finally, the war demonstrated the necessity of vigilance in the face of ideological extremism. The rise of totalitarian regimes and the consequences of unchecked aggression illustrated that peace cannot be assumed, but must be actively maintained. Through institutions, alliances, and shared moral commitment. Lessons learned from the causes, conduct, and consequences of World War II informed policymaking, education, and global governance, emphasizing that security, justice, and human dignity are interdependent. The war forced humanity to confront its capacity for destruction, while also revealing its potential for resilience, cooperation, and moral progress. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.